Good morning, everybody. Good morning. It's great to see you all here. I'm going to call on Will Robbins, who is the president of Victoria University, to welcome us to the university and to give the territorial acknowledgement this morning. So, Will Robbins.
Let me start by pausing to acknowledge that we are gathering on traditional land of Indigenous peoples. Here where we gather has been the site of human activity for many thousands of years. This land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississauga of the Credit River. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. This agreement was between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. May we be grateful for this opportunity to work on this land, to converse, reflect, learn, and act for right relations in all of our living. We are mindful of broken covenants and the need to strive to make right with all our relations by learning to live with respect in creation. Let's acknowledge this spirit and take it with us into this conference. My name is Will Robbins, as Jane mentioned, and it is my privilege and my pleasure to be the president of Victoria University. It's also an honor to be able to welcome the Canadian Creative Nonfiction Collective to this weekend of presentations and events on our campus. Victoria University has two colleges, Victoria College across the way and Emmanuel College where we are today, and both have long traditions of support for creativity, storytelling, and the exercise of conscience in all of its forms. It's a pleasure to welcome one of our Vic grads back today, Tanya Talaga, as well as one of my colleagues at the University of Toronto, Maracle. You might have seen as you walked in that one of the Victoria College buildings, the old Victoria College building and the Isabel Bader Theatre are at this time being used for the Hot Docs Documentary Film Festival, another way in which storytelling, especially nonfiction storytelling, is highlighted on our campus this year. Thank you very much to the organizers of this conference to bring the Creative Nonfiction Collective as well. So I want to wish you all the success in the events, the presentations, the participation. I hope that it's a profitable and beneficial and fun activity for all of you who are participating today. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much, Bill. Just a few housekeeping things first. Thank you to our sponsors, the Canada Council for the Arts, the Ontario Media Development Corporation, Access Copyright, and FitNet. And also just wanted to mention that we have a chair here representing one of the writers sponsored by PEN Canada, Ashraf Fayyad, a Palestinian poet whose poetry collection, Instructions Within, was banned in Saudi Arabia, where he was born and lives now. He is currently serving an 8-year sentence with 800 lashes added on, and he remains in prison while he appeals his sentence. So if you would like to, please consider signing the petition that we'll be sending back to PEN Canada to support his release. A couple housekeeping things. You know all these things anyhow. Turn off your cell phone and anything that makes noise. There will be books available offered by Ben McNally Books upstairs. And I am honored now to introduce our guests, Lee Maracle and Tanya Talaga. Lee Maracle is one of Canada's most prolific and acclaimed authors. She's received many awards for her writing, including the Premier's Award for Excellence in the Arts for Ontario in 2014. In her new book, My Conversations with Canadians, Lee Maracle asks, who are Canadians and Indigenous people separately and together? She makes a compelling argument that much Indigenous knowledge and wisdom has been ignored And that if we can acknowledge that and commit to change that, this will be a better place for all of us to be. She offers a story as illustration. Some whales were trapped under the ice in the Arctic, and some scientists called for icebreakers to help, but there were none available close by. And anyway, the Inuit said that they could sing the whales out to open water. The scientists laughed at the idea, and in the meantime, a whale died while they waited. And finally, the Inuit convinced the scientists to let them give it a try, and they cut holes in the ice at intervals, and then they walked to the floe edge where they began to sing. The whales heard them and moved from hole to hole until they reached the open water. Neither the Inuit nor the scientists knew why this worked, but it did. And I think you could say now that my conversations to Canadians is singing to us. May we listen and hear what it's saying. Tanya Talaga is an award-winning investigative journalist for the Toronto Star. In 2011, she went to Thunder Bay to ask Stan Beardy, the Grand Chief of the Anishinaabe Aski Nation, why so few Indigenous people were voting. And instead of answering that, Beardy said, "Why aren't you writing about Jordan Wabass? He's been missing for 70 days." Talaga learned that Jordan Wabass was one of 7 students from remote communities who had died since coming to Thunder Bay to go to high school. Talaga's book, 7 Fallen Feathers, Racism, Death, and Hard Truths in a Northern City, tells the story of each of those 7 cities and how they were failed by the government, the police, and the education systems. 7 Fallen Feathers won the RBC Taylor Prize for Nonfiction, and when announcing the award, the jury said, "It is impossible to read this book and come away unchanged." And I think that's a very true statement. 7 Fallen Feathers, I just learned, was also named as this month's featured book by Amnesty International as part of their book club. So Lee and Tanya will carry on a conversation for about 45 minutes, I think, and then there will be a short time for some questions after that. And pause for one moment. I have to get one.
Find a mediator. So you're in for a treat.
Before you start, we have just a small gift of tobacco to thank you for your wisdom and your thoughts. And so please join me now in welcoming Lee Maracle and Tanya Talaga.
Hanan, thanks for having us here today. We have one microphone. And, so yeah, this is our talking stick. Yeah. You should be holding it. Yeah. Listen, this is your bailiwick. And she's into radio, and so she's the storyteller. Yeah. And I was thinking, like, we cheated a bit. We met the other day, and we already had a conversation.
Yes.
And you all missed it.
It was so late.
You thought I was late, right? But I wrote down a couple things, so I thought that maybe we could start with some of those things. And one of the things I thought actually we could start with is explaining the difference between what we do. Because Lee is Lee. Lee is one of the best storytellers I know, and Lee is an oral storyteller that happens to write books.
Yeah.
Because the words somehow find their way onto the page. And I do something very different. I write nonfiction, and I find story that way. We sort of end up in the same place, but we do very different things. And so I thought that maybe, this is one of the things that when we were talking, I'm just like, wow, it's just like Lee is in a totally different league than me. I mean, in so many ways. I'm here just to hold her coattails, basically. So I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about the writing process and how you harness what's here get to hear.
It's true that I'm a storyteller. I'm actually trained to be a storyteller. And I started off with lying to my grandpa. I wanted to die, and then because I watched all the emotions he went through. My grandfather was Chief Dan George, and before he was a famous actor, he was a very famous chief all over British Columbia. His father, George, was also a very famous leader of the Allied tribes, so on and so forth. And before that, his great-grandmother, his great-grandmother is the Princess of Peace and so on. So it's a stellar heritage, and he was a stellar individual. And there I was, this little snot that dared to lie to him. But anyway, he's staring at me, and finally he realizes something, and his eyes get a little twinkle, and he says, "That's a good story." So then I got trotted to all these elders, and they would tell me a story, and I would tell it back different, but the same, to howls of laughter, because I don't know if that was because I failed miserably or because I was just entertaining, I don't know. But in any case, nobody told me that I was doing it right or wrong. And that was always unnerving, because I like telling stories. But I regaled children, particularly my siblings. I have 22 of them. And that became who I was. And then I wanted to be a writer, and I thought there was something different about writing. And as long as I thought that, I didn't actually write very much. It was just stuck in a journal. And then I was sitting there, I was talking to my brother. I said, "I don't understand this, effing business of writing." And he says, "Yeah, I can see that." He said, "You're talking to a tree." And he picks up a piece of paper, and he says, "It takes one small pine to make this piece of paper." And then I realized I was talking to a tree. And I had divorced myself from that. And as soon as I jumped outside my culture, then I didn't know what I was doing. So I was trying to be you in some contorted, distorted, and bizarre way, which I was not educated to be. And that's the thing. So this chair, I pushed it over here. Nobody puts one out for us, even though for 80 years we weren't published in this country. In my first book, I was told they wouldn't publish it because Indians don't read and write, and that was true. So I and Frontier College and 12 Indigenous high school graduates that went to white schools taught 3,500 Indians to read, and then we got them to sign a petition that they would buy my book now that they could read. That was the price of getting here. So I got published, and 3,500 people did buy the book. By the way, within the first 3 months, they didn't know that it would be popular. It's still going. It's an amazing little book. I'm not real fond of it anymore, but it's 40. It's been around a long time. But the thing is that we do story, and we're talking to someone. And it's not a someone that's necessarily human. To you, even those of you that are environmentalists, you don't call trees people. We do. In our language, there's no distinction between a bear person, a human person, a moose person, a sky person, or any other rock person for that matter. And so, because that's the way it is in the language, we don't distinguish automatically between this, and that stone over there that you call glass. Just because you transformed it doesn't make it different. It's still glass, that's stone, it's still stone. And I don't know what this is, I guess it's styrofoam oil product or something, but in any case, whatever it is at its birth, that's what it stays. But you can call it a transformer person, which is what that glass would be. And that's a very high-ranking person in Stalo Nation. I'm a transformer person because I can go from the language of storytelling, like this, to talking to the trees and putting it on paper, and then getting everybody else to duplicate it. It's sort of like my grandfather was invited to 1,000 places to tell stories. That's, in our world, is, you know, the height of everything. So if you publish 1,000 books, then it's like telling stories 1,000 times. So it's a big deal in my world. Canada's beginning to notice that I'm around. I suppose because I'm on the way out, I don't know. She won't be around much longer, let's give her something. But my folks have been honoring me since I was 40. It was my second book when I turned 40. And so that's a big deal. It's a huge deal. And then when you have 13 or 14 of them out there, people hold you in awe. And the thing is that people are still trying to teach us to write. I was a journalist before I was a writer. I was a journalist. How can we all start out as journalists? Richard was a journalist. You know, all these people. I think Tom King was a photojournalist. But anyway, in any case, we're moving to another medium, but not changing what we do. So the story, she's finding the story through the journalism, through research and through, you know, talking to people. So it's through her oratory and her search that she finds the story. And then it becomes a book, but it's still a story. And I think Tom King I actually wrote that, first of all, if you take the story out of math, you don't have much of a text. You know what I mean? You got maybe 10 sums and then that's it. You gotta go to something else. But once the story's taken out, it's a very dreary subject. So then Tom took it one step further and said, we're about story and that's all we are. And I'm not sure I'd go that far. I told him that, well, Tom, you know, when I was having a baby, I went to the best midwife, not the best storyteller.
You see why she's who she is? Remarkable. We do come at story in so different ways, but we also, I hope, in some ways achieve the same thing. My father was Polish 100%, and so that's that side of me, and my mom is Anishinaabe from Northern Ontario. And you know, it's interesting when I look at my history, when we talk about this and how we come to story, mine is very different from yours, and it's interesting, the West Coast is so different. I've just spent 2 weeks in BC, weirdly in Stolo, oddly in Seabird, you know, it's where she's from. And I just got back on Wednesday night learning about story, actually, and spending time with your relatives that I didn't even know were your relatives until we started talking about it.
So we were talking about my relatives.
It was on Thursday, and you missed that conversation too. Since it was in the notes, I got it all here. Yeah. But you know, I come from a different background. I come from a disjointed background. I come from a background of my mother lost her brothers to the child welfare system, and my sister was also adopted out. And it was a different culture, it was a different time, you know, everyone was hiding in residential school or they were survivors. So it's broken. And I feel like I'm sort of going in a circle, which is cultural actually, but it seems like that's how I travel. And I am very much almost the product of a colonized system. I went to university here. I learned a lot here. This is, and I actually chose to come here. I was lucky that I got in, first off. Sort of scraped in, I think, with my grades. But I came here because of actually Margaret Atwood. I was a big fan of what she wrote. I know, isn't that funny? And so I think, and so I wanted to sort of, whatever she had, I wanted to seep into me. And I knew she had been here, and this was perhaps a place that could do that for me. But the more I wrote, though, the more I found myself going back north, going to where my mother's from, going to the places that I spent time as a child. And that became important to me, and I think that story came to me that way. And I have been a journalist for a long time, but I also have never really felt comfortable being in my skin as a journalist. Like, my stories were just very black and white for a very long period of time, until I was able to do more feature writing. And then I think when you're given that latitude and the voice comes that's sort of in you and sort of struggling to get out very much. And then I realized that what I do is very much that way, what you just described it. It's like I talk to people, I get their stories, people tell me their stories, and I feel blessed to be trusted by the people in the North with their stories, and that is what comes to me, and they are gifts. And I do try not to ever be a story taker, which is a concept that I've talked to Duncan McHugh about quite a bit, about being very conscious of where the stories come from, and you're gifted them, and how to write them down. And actually, I didn't realize, too, that I spoke in this voice until Lee told me I did. She said to me, "You know what you do?" She said, "This is what you do." This is, we were at Idle No More's 5th anniversary, the round dance at Yonge and Dundas Square, and it was like -30, it was freezing, and we were having this talk, and she said to me, "You know, you look forwards and you look backwards at the same time when you write." Yeah, it's like the string that's pulled. And I didn't realize that that's what I do, but that is exactly what I do. I look both ways. And I think that that's also part of how we tell stories. And how we see, which is, I think, different from most people. Do we see differently than most people? Yeah, I think so.
I think the ability to look back is skewed in Canada by the falsehoods you've been told, and this, your body knows they're false. Just your mind doesn't know what to replace them with, though. It's sort of like the glass is only half full, and so you can't, the top half's looking back and the bottom half's looking forward. So the bottom half feels a little bit murky too. There's a hesitation in Canadian writing. Someone said to me the other day, "Where do you get all these sayings?" Because I was talking about, let's have some logic here. I was getting a little bit crazy with my fellow panelists, who are all white, mostly men. I don't know why they do that to me. I'm not very good with all white men. Especially old ones who think they know everything. They suddenly realized that they suddenly got humble because I'd make these little sayings. Like the Inuit thing, like, why could we not talk to them in their language? Well, first of all, scientists didn't believe whales had a language. And then they did, and now they don't again, because, they say it's too simple. Well, I think it's too simple because they don't speak it very well. It's sort of like my people saying that English has no discipline and it's a simple language. It can't handle the knowledge of star nations. So when I was talking to Tanya about what she did in this business of looking both ways at the same time, there's words for that in my language, sort of like, to speak them, the way we language. But you don't have that in English. You don't have a word for it. And Mom used to say, the closest I can get is figures out. They don't have any figures out. I started laughing. I said, that's not a word. That's two words that you put together. Figures doesn't have an S, doesn't take an S. It just never takes it. She'd say, well, that's what I say. Anyway, she goes on with something else. And then you're left with languaging it in your own mind, in your own language, but then not being able to explain to any more than 6 people, because that's how many Stalo speak the language, you know, okay. And then I had to figure out how to do that in English, and I start to see it in our symbology on the cover of my Conversations with Canadians. Does anyone have it handy? If you want to show people, there's a teepee, and Jamie Black is sitting in the center. And the center is that which is hidden and unknown and treasured. That's what's in the center. And then you pull that up, and you've got poles opposing each other that then become supporting each other. And then the ones at the top point to the sky world. So the sky world has a knowledge too. And the Crees and Ojibways are most familiar with that knowledge, though one of my nations is connected to the women of Ojibwe and Cree, and that's the Talaga. And I'm a little bit Talaga, so my daughter always says, oh, that's probably why we hung out with them people. But anyway, mostly Stalo. But that's how I came to be connected to the Crees and the Ojibways, as well as through my mother, who's Cree Métis. So this Star Nation knowledge is what we're missing. What we're missing, I don't know if you miss it, but we certainly do. Because the transmission, before we went to residential school, was like a skeleton key to a treasure house of knowledge. We were given the skeleton key, and we could use it or not. But we were not given all the knowledge. So then we have to agglomerate and aggregate and synthesize that knowledge, which is what we were doing at our house there. And that's what I was doing for her about how she comes at story. Every chance I get, I'm synthesizing for Indigenous young people. I consider her young. I don't think you're younger than my kids, are you? No? Really? So did my daughter. Yeah, you do. She does. She looks great. I have an older kid than her, though. I mean, than that daughter. That's my second daughter. But in any case, you know, we have. I still consider her a young writer. She's got her first book out, and she's much newer than I am. I've been around the block. So when I get to be a certain age, at Grandma's age, we have a ceremony, and you're to walk everybody home. That's your job. So everybody that doesn't know something, you know, someone like Joseph Boyden screws up, I have to go and talk to him. You know, like, okay, sit down. Give me some tobacco first. But anyhow, this is the role that you play. So then you have to think about yourself in relation to you, which I didn't think about when I was young. I just did what I did. And it was hard to get published, but I did get published. And some of my books are still going. Like, I think Raven Song was in its 35th printing or some ridiculous thing. So, you know, I've kind of lived off that with 4 kids, going to college, all of that. I managed to get by with writing in Canada, which is very unusual. I do teach one course, though. I'm a little bit cheap, you know, so I can have some extra potty money.
You mentioned when we were, you mentioned so many things, but one of the things you just mentioned now briefly, but when we were talking to, was about how we also view residential schools. And the need to sort of, in some ways, look at it in a different way and to reclaim it. Like, it's, we have to look at it as if we're victors. You know, the genocide did not work, cultural genocide that happened. We're still here, and I think we're getting louder. Yeah. So, yeah, way louder, and it's taken a while, and I know I spend a lot of time looking at residential school history and going through, because this is true what I do, I beetle through the National Truth and Reconciliation Center archives. I talk to lots of survivors I'm always in awe of the survivors that I know, and I'm always in awe of the damage that has been done. So I'm also going to try and train my brain, though, to think victors. When you said that to me the other day, I'm like, that's such a good way to look at it, because it's like it's now, it's taken generations to come out of this, to go back to things like language. And we can talk about that too, because language was not, it was taken from us. We didn't lose it. It's there.
And here's the interesting thing. How many people are actually of British descent in this room? 1, 2. So about a third of you, looks like, maybe 25%. So the other 2/3 or 75%, somewhere in there, cannot communicate with your body. How about that, eh? How does that feel? Yeah, that's where we are too. If we don't have our mother tongue, you can't communicate with your body because your body keeps speaking the mother tongue. So if you're British, you're okay. Now we wonder why British people in this country always get ahead. Well, because they're whole. That makes sense, doesn't it? The rest of us are not. We're missing everything from here down. And this is an intelligent being. And we always say that the forever memory is in the body. And the words to it are just under the skin. That's a saying in our language. That's, 10,000 years old or so. And some white guy found the organ that's doing it. And it is just under the skin, in the layer of fat. Ladies, we have more fat, so we probably have a bigger organ. That's the only one that's bigger than, that other organ. The one that plays different tunes. But in any case, we don't communicate with that body. We don't have the richness of that text. The farther backward you have, the more grandmothers you have, the more history you have. And if you can put yourself in that context, go with that text, then you can be whole and then some. You can be an historian easily. I've heard these guys from Six Nations and Ojibwe speakers out here, and I'm always awed. They can get up and recite the whole history of colonization, all the dates and names and everything, without even a note. And I thought, I cannot fucking remember what my grandfather did in 1966, let alone everybody else, and what they were doing. But it's because they're whole, first of all. There's been no break in their cultural being, despite the dissociation from language. They were severed from their language, but not from the people. My father spent 12 years away from his mother. He came back. The first person he went to see was his mother. And the second person he went to see was his grandmother. And he stayed with his grandmother because he could barely speak our language. So he told his mother that he's going to go back and live with Tanya because she has the words he needs. He's missing a lot of words. And she said that was okay. So then he stayed with Tanya till he was about 22 and picked up the language again. And then from his father, he picked up Squamish, which is another language that's one of our languages. I think in our family we had 4. We gave up the family language. And we did this very consciously, and people saying, oh, we're losing our language. No, it's not in a shoebox under the bed. We either speak it or we do not. And so when we came back from residential school, this was the problem, my father said. We came back the same age that we left. We were 6. But nobody wanted to face that because they were getting married and had their own children. And your grandmother didn't want to favor you over the other real grandchildren. She'd say, what's wrong with this guy, Like he acts like a baby. Well, that's because he was cut off at 6. So you come into the house and you don't know what to do. Imagine going to your mother's house and not knowing what to do. You know where to put your shoes in your mother's house, don't you? We didn't. And I'd have to instruct everybody. And then I became the family know-it-all because I didn't go to residential school. So then I'm separated from my siblings by a long ways. And we just had a big family reunion about 8 years ago, 10 years ago, to repair that. Because I was separated from all my siblings at 6. And it just took forever to repair that damage. And there was a lot of resentments, and instead of naming who it was, we say we lost the language. So we're taking responsibility for being severed, for being removed. Yeah? And it's not our responsibility. We did not do that to ourselves. We didn't get up one morning and say, I don't like this language. I'm going to start to speak something else. I'm going to speak something else. Nobody said that. None of you did either, whatever language you come from. If it's your dad's Polish, you know, whatever language we come from. So then, we're taking responsibility for something we didn't do, so we don't know how to fix it. So then it becomes crazying. And that's the whole 60s, 70s, 80s, and all the things that go with that. Is on top of that is the abuse issues. And the abuse issues for me is the least of the problem. It is the removal. That's the genocide crime. It's not the beatings. You can beat people of another race, that's not a genocide act. I don't know why, but it's not. You can rape them all, that's still not a genocide act. But if you remove the children from their families, then it's an act of genocide. Canada committed genocide for 30 years after it signed the convention. That's what we have to struggle with, is the genocide. And it's the same as the Somalis and the Rwandans and all the others that are enduring genocide today. Jewish people still in their 3rd generation of recovery. And we've learned a lot about how to recover from the Jewish people. But that's part of where we are now. Plus, Canada's not willing to take responsibility for it. It says, I mean, Harker said this was an act of genocide and it was wrong. And sorry. Sorry. 75% of the Crees in Saskatchewan died the first 25 years, consistently. 75%, 75%. 75% of Toronto was 2.5 million, 2.5 million, 2.5 million. Eventually you run out. They pretty much ran out of kids. And then they started treating them better, 1940.
And then child welfare.
Yeah.
So that's
I'm not predicting that.
yeah. So that's the other side of that just keeps going. And not just child welfare though, the justice system, the health system. The more I look into these things, the more I see it. You know, when I was writing Seven Fallen Feathers, I didn't expect to be taking such a deep dive into education and seeing how the system, well, there is no system for Indigenous kids almost. What's there has failed so much. I mean, I think that we're at the beginning of trying to decolonize, and I think that that's the only way to sort of move forward. You know, Cindy Blackstock sometimes talks about how we need a giant Marshall Plan to get over all of these things that have happened, to get over residential school, to get over child welfare. And what she means by that, if I can say, as I've heard her talk about this, is, you know, everyone needs equity. We need to be brought on an equitable footing in order to keep going. Because for so long, an entire percentage of the people that live on Turtle Island didn't get that equity at all. They were always treated as less than. And there's always been a thing, it's always bugged me, it's just one of the things that I always saw, just, being little, is the indifference people have always had towards Indigenous people. I remember using to tell people, well, my mom is Ojibwe, and they would look at me like I had 25 heads. Nobody knew what that was in the education system. No one...
1/3 of Canada's Ojibwe.
Yeah, it's like, it was, and you always felt really weird. And because when you would tell people that, and you're trying to sort of figure out still who you are because of all of these things that happened to your family in the past, and then you say to people, this is who I am. And then they look at you like you're crazy, because they don't know what that is, and they don't understand it, and you're still trying to figure out who it is and where you're from. And where you're from is so important. And that's one of the things you'll always hear from people. But if you meet another First Nations person, this is the first thing they say is, where are you from? Because it's a concept of belonging. Where are you from? It's, you were talking about removal and about the kids taken, not just from their families, but from the land. And that is also at the heart of where the genocide is. So when you take the land, especially from us, you take everything. There were Indigenous people did not pen themselves into tiny little reserves and say, this is where we want to live. That never happened. Everyone just they followed the land, and if some of the land looked like it had been used too much, they moved on to another spot. Or if the animals, they needed to go in a different way or follow the animals, that's where people move to, And then what happens is, I write and read a lot about treaty. Try not to go into it too much, but let's just say it didn't really work out very well for one side of the signatures, and that was us. Because when treaties were signed, it was signed in an act of good faith. And it was also signed in different periods. I've just recently really been looking to Treaty Number 9, which is most of the province of Ontario, actually. Almost about 2/3 of the province, which is in northern Ontario, is Treaty Number 9. And it was signed in 1905. And when I look at how that went about and why it was signed too, the people in the north were all starving. It was a really bad period. Everyone was starving, and they were sick. They had, I think it was measles at that point. And the people were dying and they needed help. And what had happened was the fur traders and people were coming and they were taking things off the land and things that the First Nations how they were living. And then they were being boxed into certain spots, and then they were sick and they couldn't move. So they signed this treaty, a treaty in a totally different language. Here we talk about language again, language that nobody really understood. In 1905, nobody in Northern Ontario had a huge grounded history in British colonial law. No clue whatsoever. They were getting advised by people like the church. That didn't go very well either. It's just a sort of a downward spiral, to be totally frank. And then I look a lot about that too, and I see about what's happening now, and I think that the disconnection with the land is so integral to what happened to everyone, and we're all still trying to sort of claw our way out of it and find a new path. Because as you said, survivors, victors, everyone is here, and we're trying to reclaim. You also spoke about language a bit, and my great-grandparents raised my mother, and my great-grandmother was a residential school survivor, and she came out of the school, which my great-grandfather called the factory, like a crazy holy roller. And I remember my great-grandmother speaking Ojibwe. I remember it. She's also know too that we had babies when we were rather early. So all of these, we're fortunate to have grandparents and great-grandparents in our life for maybe a longer period of time than other people would. And I remember clearly them speaking, but only outside. She wouldn't allow the language be brought into the house because to her, language was dirty. And she came out of school thinking that everything Indian was dirty. And that's how she raised my mother. You know, she loved the Queen. She loved, she tells us, my mom tells the story of being lined up by the railway tracks and they had to wear their brightest and their best outfits, which when you lived in the bush in a shack was not very much, and everything was homemade, and they had to stand there because the Queen was going by on a train.
Wow.
You know, and sort of salute the Queen. And my great-grandmother would tell people she was Irish, or she would tell people that she was Scottish. Depended on the mood, I guess, you know, and then her sister would say something different. French was common, yeah. And so there's such a, it was almost, you know, into my mom, it was sort of beaten into my mom of, you know, don't leave that. That's not who you are. And that's what we all live with in different degrees. But it's, you know, what's so cool though is what you're talking about with language. There are certain languages in Anishinaabe Nation, for example, which is Treaty Number 9, which is Northern Ontario, north of Thunder Bay, east to the James Bay coast, north to Hudson Bay, and west to the Manitoba border. There are entire communities where language is there 100%. Pikangikum, 100%. Ojibwe speakers. Most of the kids that I wrote about that died in Thunder Bay coming to high school, they spoke English as a second language. They spoke Ojibwe, was very popular in northwestern Ontario. It is the language there, and Ojibwe. And that is a wild, wild thing. And that hasn't disappeared.
Yeah, I think the languages are on their road to recovery, and I think the Canadian state owes us that. I think they need to pay our teachers for that language, and I think Canadians need to get on Carolyn Bennett's case about it, because it's taking the money out of people's pockets to do this work. I think Brian Maracle's being paid by Six Nations Confederacy, but they sell cigarettes, you know, so they can afford it. The rest of us are not willing to break the law to the extent that the Confederacy, it really does behave as its own nation. I actually respect and appreciate that, though I don't know if I would be the one to advocate selling cigarettes, but you do what you can. You do what you can, that's what I think. My mother used to say, we don't starve in a grocery store. She liked Hank Williams. I don't know if you guys like Hank Williams, but anyway, the business of restoring the language is being done by people on a voluntary basis, and then Canadians have the gall to come and ask me why we're so unemployed. And I just wanted to say, oh fuck, you know, like, you have no idea what's happened here. One of the traumas of Canada was the 1919 flu. That was a national trauma. And what happened was the flu ran through Canada. I think probably 1 million people died. Maybe that many, I don't know. But in any case, it made a real spike in family violence. Family violence tripled in Canada. And in the United States, and in France, and in Italy. The point is that any catastrophe will lead to a spike in family violence. Doesn't matter what the catastrophe is. It could be war. The First World War was another catastrophe that led to family violence all over the world, particularly in Russia, who, you know, suffered the most. And then the Second World War, same thing. Russia's alcoholism is more fierce than anywhere in the world, even more fierce than in our communities. You could compare them with the Inuits. You know, the current colonization of the North is making the Inuit people pretty sad. So all of this happens, and people think that you just get over it. And I wish that Terry Fox could have gotten over having one leg, but it wasn't going to happen. You can give him a metal leg, but he's not fit to run across the country, and he wasn't. And he died. I think he was 25. He was my friend, and my cousin's friend. They went to school together. I watched them play soccer together, these two boys. And I remember my husband very smartly saying, well, it's going to be his It's going to be as long as I get it next. And I said, don't say that, he's going to make it. And of course he didn't. And you're sitting there, oh fuck, he's not going to make it. You want him to make it. Well, multiply that by, I don't know, 50,000 people. We're going to make it. So when I started looking at it, historically. Canada went to war against us to remove us from the land, first of all, and secondly, to acculturate us in some way. At the bottom, though. And it's very clear about that. If you look at the race riots in Vancouver, it's because Indians were rising to the top, and BC said, well, we can't have that. We cannot have that. We cannot have, there was a school that had Native girls and white girls in it, and one white Native girl did better than everybody else, so they took the white girls out and we put Indigenous people in a different school, didn't teach them the same thing. You cannot have in this country Indians doing better than everybody else, and particularly the women. It's very, very difficult. I think Marilyn Dumont said it, you know, if you're going to be an Indigenous woman writer, you're going to have a hard time. And that's exactly what they give you. Hard time all the way through. As soon as there's a guy, though, boom, put him up the front. Everybody knows who Thomas King is. Thomas King, who studied Lee Maracle. Joseph Boydman studied Lee Andel. You know, I mean, it's just ridiculous that Richard Wallabies, and so on and so forth, they all came after the women. The women came first. And it was such a struggle for a decade. We went from one place to village to place, you know, trying to get bookstores to carry our books. We went to booksellers' conferences. We got on radio, we got on TV, we had to wage a political fight to get Canadians interested, because it was a bunch of Indigenous women. But now, that's starting to change, because people are starting to look at the TRC, which is, of course, the work of a great man, Mr. Murray Sinclair, Senator Sinclair. Well, again, hats off to him. And Marie, his little helper, a woman. And so now you're starting to awake to, okay, we got to do something. Plus, the women in this country, Indigenous women, have been fighting the murder of Indigenous women for almost 30 years. It's been going on since colonialism began, though, make no mistake. I left Vancouver because they were starting to chase my children. I endured that. 33 attempted rapes in the course of 3 years as a teenager. And then I decided, the fucking hell, I'm not getting out of here. This is an insane place. And lo and behold, it's in every other city. So you pretty much gotta hide. Yeah? Or live amongst the Italians so that you don't look so, you know, brown and whatnot, you know. Oh my God, this country is got a sickness. And then when you talk to someone about it, they say, no. What, are you telling me that I'm a liar? What are you saying? You don't know nothing about your country? Not surprised. Not surprised. But what is it? Is it because your acculturation and language defamation was acceptable? Was that what happened? I sometimes think there's some of that going on. Because I run into Hungarians or Polish people that don't teach their kids the language. They come here, and the first thing the deputy minister said when I was doing the land acknowledgement for them was, forget everything you knew. Now you're in Canada. And there's all these people from all over the world. And I got up and I said, no, I don't want you to forget anything. I want you to bring it so that one day we will have a university. They call this a university, but it's not. Where's the African knowledge, the Hungarian knowledge, the Polish knowledge, the whoever's knowledge? There's 167 nations living in this city. Think of the opportunity. Think of the cultural opportunity. Canada has the the capacity to move to the forefront of cultural theory in the world because everybody's here. If we get over ourselves, our so-called British selves, right? And start talking with each other. I'm engaging discussions with African women on oratory, an oratorical course that goes around the globe. I want to study the Gadad like my daughter did. They have this international language, English language degree. She was able to study the Gadadan, and they cut it out. They cut it out. In this town, we've abused everyone so much about their culture that they don't even want to know that they have another culture. No Irish person wants to read the Gadadan.
I don't think there's anything left to say. Other than, not to embarrass you right now, but you are a treasure. You are a treasure to me. Speaking of which, for what you have done for people like me, and I couldn't do this without you doing it first and doing it harder. It's a cheating pitch.
Thank you so much. I don't know if all of you feel the way I do. I could have sat here all day and listened but and we just have a very short time. If anyone has questions now, maybe 5 minutes at most. So there's one right at the very back.
Could you say a bit more about storytelling versus storytelling?
Sorry about that. Yeah, it's story, and I think it's, especially when you're talking, well, in journalism, a lot of people, they want to get the Indigenous voice into a story. And so, you know, they call a reserve, they call somebody that they believe is Indigenous to get comment on something. And oftentimes too, you know, they're calling about a story that's a tragedy. A lot of times our stories that wind up in the newspaper are all about tragedy. It's all about murdered and missing women, or about, you know, a car accident or something awful, or a suicide. And so they cold call family, you know, and journalists do, and then they expect to get an answer. And that's kind of story, that's story taking. Like, you know, it's just like calling out of the blue and saying, hey, this is what I'm looking for. Do you have any comment on this? But we all miss out when that kind of story taking happens. I mean, that's not a responsible way to do anything, really. I mean, if you're serious about learning about someone's story, it's best to get to know that person. It's best to be respectful, and sometimes it doesn't come in a 6-hour news bite, or you're not going to get an answer right away. But if you take the time to have a relationship with that person, and I think this matters with any kind of journalism, not just with talking to Indigenous people, but with anyone really. I mean, be careful of what you're doing, and, you know, be respectful of what you're entering into, and take the time to get to know who you're talking to and give back. You know, like in 2 months, call that person back, or after the story runs, and ask them, how are you? How are things? You know, care a bit. And that goes a long way to trust and to relationship building, and you're going to get a better story at the end of the day because you cared and you weren't a taker.
I think the whole of the media takes. There's 5,000 organizations in this country that were started by Indigenous women in the modern era. 5,000. Doing a multitude of things. Not one has been reported on ever. You know, so all this stuff on the tragedy, you know, like I think we should know about tragedy when it happens. But the tragedy that happened on Young and Finch of, you know, a whole bunch of people getting killed there, and the tragedy of the serial killer, Arthur, whatever his name is, it was men of color or gay. I think that should be known. But Toronto's a lot of things. And you get a full rounded coverage. You never get that with Indigenous people. All we do is drink and die. I mean, that's just ridiculous. Yeah.
Anyone else?
Not pertaining to writing, but you mentioned me in the construction of TP and what the center stood for, and I missed everything after the first one, so I wonder if you could.
Okay, hold the book up so she can see it. Sue Ann wants to see it again. You see those posts?
Yes.
They have the 4 cardinal directions, north, east, south, west, and then the poles that go to the star world in between, the earthly world, and then they're flat on the ground, and then as they raise them, the center, where Jamie Black is sitting, is for that which is unknown, cherished, and hidden. That's how we explore something. You guys argue, use the Roman evidentiary process, which, by the way, was a very aggressive patriarchal process, and then you don't want to reproduce patriarchy. I don't understand how you can do those two things and not reproduce patriarchy, but there you go. And anyway, the short poles go to the sky world, where there is a whole universe of knowledge, and it comes back down. We call that Siniquid. The northern Ojibways, where I worked, called that Rizokatatwin. The way we discover things, the way we explore things. So in my class, I use that exploration model. And what happens is, invariably, the students get smarter by the week. Because they have knowledge, just nobody's using it. They come there and their instructors, because they studied the tsetse fly or whatever the hell they studied, got a big head about the tsetse fly and want everybody to know about the tsetse fly, and then they test them on the tsetse fly. I'm sorry, but you're recycling something that you did. That's not what I want my students to do. I want my students to be cultural theorists. And that's how I became one. I'm a leading cultural theorist in the world. They called me to an all-African writers conference to talk about that. I was the only non-black there. I thought, what am I doing here? And they told me, you're a cultural theorist. We want to know about that. We're new to this business of writing. This is 25 years ago.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you, Lee and Tanya. Before you go, I just want to say that both your books will be for sale upstairs, and if you're willing to sign them, would you be able to? Okay, that's great. All right. Thank you very much,
Hi, how are you? How are you? All right.